Wyoming Territory, 1883. The wind cut sharp across the open platform of the tiny rail stop in Bitter Creek, and Priscilla North held her hat against it, forcing down the rising panic in her chest. The train had pulled away 10 minutes ago, leaving behind nothing but dust, the smell of coal, and her hope that anyone would be waiting. But no one was. She stood alone with her carpetbag and wedding dress packed carefully inside, the letter from George T. Miller folded in her coat pocket, worn soft from all the times she had read it over the past 2 months. He had written kind words, a little formal, but promising her a home, a future, and a chance to be a wife after 2 long years of loneliness since her mother passed. Priscilla had answered the ad in the Boston paper because she had nothing left to lose. But now her groom was nowhere to be seen. A gust caught her skirt, whipping it around her legs as she stepped down from the platform into the dry dirt of the road. The town was barely more than a general store, a livery, and a saloon with a crooked sign. A dog barked somewhere far off. No one looked her way. She took a deep breath. "He is probably just late," she whispered to herself. Maybe he had trouble with his horse. She waited. An hour passed, then 2. The sun slid higher, baking the ground. Her lips cracked. Still no George T. Miller. The general store door creaked open and a man in a dusty apron stepped out. He looked her over, then scratched his beard. "Miss, you been standin' there quite a while. You need something?" She forced a smile. "I am meeting someone. George Miller. He was supposed to be here." The man frowned. "George left town near 3 weeks ago. Headed south. Said he was closing up his claim, moving on." He looked at her again, this time with pity. "You his bride?" Her stomach dropped. She nodded once. "Sorry. Mississippi, guess he changed his mind." Her fingers tightened on the handle of her bag. Her heart thudded in her chest. She turned away before he could say anything else, stumbling to the side of the building where the shadows offered a sliver of cool. She slid down the wall and sat, dust coating the hem of her dress. Her throat burned, but she could not cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. She had come all this way. Sold her mother's locket. Rode on that train for days. And now a thundering sound rose over the ridge. Hooves, fast and steady. She looked up. A horse crested the hill, rider tall in the saddle, moving with purpose. His hat was pulled low, a rifle tied behind his saddle, and a coil of rope at his side. Dust coated his boots and trail-worn duster, but he rode like a man who knew exactly where he was going. He slowed as he neared the store, his eyes catching hers beneath the brim of his hat. He stopped. "You all right, madam?" His voice was low and calm, like a riverbank after rain. She stood slowly, brushing off her skirt. "No, I am not all right." He dismounted in one swift motion, holding his horse by the reins. Up close, he was younger than she expected, maybe 30, with dark hair, sun-browned skin, and eyes the color of the prairie sky. "What happened?" he asked. "My groom was supposed to meet me, but he left without a word. I came all the way from Massachusetts." Her voice cracked. "I do not know anyone here." He glanced toward the store, then back to her. "That is a hard thing. I am sorry. Do you live here?" "No, just passing through." "My name is Lawson Cole." He extended a hand. She hesitated, then took it. "Priscilla North." He nodded once, then looked around the street. "You got a place to stay?" She shook her head. "No. I do not know what to do." Lawson looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen. "Drink, then come with me. I am headed to my homestead. It is a ways out, but it is clean and safe. I will not leave you out here." She hesitated. "You do not even know me." "No, but I know what it is like to be left behind." She studied his face. There was something quiet there, something steady. She took the canteen and drank. The water was warm and clean. He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance. They rode out of Bitter Creek as the sun dipped lower, the wind at their backs. By the time they reached his land, the stars were out and the moon cast silver light across the grass. His cabin sat near a grove of cottonwoods, sturdy and simple, with smoke curling from the chimney. He helped her down. "I only have the one bed," he said. "You can take it. I will sleep by the fire." She turned to him. "You do not have to. I want to." Inside, the cabin was neat. A stone hearth, a small table, shelves with supplies. Lawson laid out a blanket by the fire and handed her a folded nightdress from a trunk. "It belonged to my sister before she married and moved east. You can use it if you like." "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, then turned to give her privacy. Later, lying in the bed, she watched the flames flicker low. Lawson was a quiet shape by the fire, his chest rising and falling steady. "Lawson," she whispered. He turned his head slightly. "Why did you help me?" There was a pause. "Because you looked like someone who needed to be seen." She stared at the ceiling, her chest aching. "Thank you." He did not reply, but she saw his silhouette relax. And for the first time since she stepped off that train, she did not feel quite so alone. Lawson rose before first light, careful not to stir the air near the hearth. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the wooden floor. He moved quietly through the cabin, pouring a measure of cornmeal into a tin bowl, then adding water from the kettle he'd left warming near the coals. The spoon scraped soft against the sides as he stirred. Behind him, the bed creaked faintly. He didn't turn. Priscilla sat up slowly, her hair falling loose past her shoulders. She blinked toward the window, where the sky was just beginning to shift from black to gray. "I didn't expect to sleep," she said softly, her voice rough with mourning. "But I did." Lawson nodded once. "That's good." She wrapped her arms around her knees, the borrowed nightdress gathered at her ankles. "Do you live alone?" "I do." "Do you ever get lonely?" He stirred the cornmeal again, slower this time. "Used to it, I guess. Long days don't feel so long when you've got work to do." She watched him a moment, then stood and folded the blanket she'd slept under. Her movements were careful, like a guest unsure of her place. "I'll help," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to." He didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a second spoon and nodded toward the table. She moved beside him, stirring the pot in silence while the wind whispered outside. After breakfast, Lawson saddled his horse and hitched up the cart. The mare had a steady gait, not fast but sure, and the wheels creaked as they rolled down the narrow trail lined with rabbit brush and dry sage. Priscilla sat beside him on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, a scarf tied around her hair. The sky had turned pale blue, the kind that seemed to stretch forever. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Neighbor a few miles west. Old Swedish couple, the Jorgensens. They keep chickens. I trade eggs for flour sometimes." She watched the land roll by, wide and quiet. "Is it always this still?" "Most days." "How far's the nearest town?" 30 miles if you count Green River. Closer to 40 if you want a doctor or a post office." She looked toward the horizon. "I've never been this far from buildings before." Lawson glanced at her face, pale in the sunlight. "Hardest part's the silence. After a while, it lays over you like snow. Some folks learn to carry it. Some don't." "Which are you?" He didn't answer right away. "I carry it." The Jorgensen's cabin rose out of the prairie like a patch of old wood woven into the grass. Smoke drifted from a crooked chimney, and a line of white hens scattered as the cart approached. A woman with a kerchief tied at the back of her neck stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Lawson tipped his hat. "Morning, Marta. You're late," she said, but her voice held no heat. "I saved the brown eggs like you asked." He climbed down and turned to help Priscilla from the cart. She reached for his hand without hesitation. Marta's eyes flicked between them. "This your wife?" "No," Lawson said. Priscilla's cheeks colored, but she didn't look away. Marta handed over the basket. "Well, you'd best look after her proper. This land doesn't forgive carelessness." "We're not careless," Priscilla said, steady. Back in the cart, as they turned toward home, Lawson kept his eyes on the trail. "You didn't have to say anything." She folded her hands again. "I wanted to." They rode in silence until the cabin came into view, the chimney already beginning to catch the light of the setting sun. Inside, Lawson removed his coat and hung it on the peg behind the door. Priscilla moved to the wash basin and rolled up her sleeves. "I can prepare supper," she said. "You sure?" "Yes." He nodded once, then stepped onto the porch, leaving her inside with the quiet clatter of tin plates and the soft thud of cupboard doors. He sat on the top step, elbows on his knees, watching the wind stir the grass. She was strong, he'd seen that already, not in the way of loud words or hard hands, but in how she met the day without flinching, how she'd looked Marta in the eye and claimed her place. That night they ate by lamplight. She had found dried beans and half a jar of pickled beets and made a meal from both. She didn't speak much, but she didn't look afraid anymore. Afterward, Lawson poured her the last of the tea and sat across from her, hands wrapped around his own chipped mug. "I don't expect you to stay," he said, "but if you want to until you get your bearings, you're welcome." She held his gaze. "I don't know where else I would go." He gave a small nod and drank. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and for the first time that day, she leaned back in her chair like she belonged in it. He banked the fire before bed. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the flames settle. "I was supposed to start a new life," she said. "You did," Lawson said, "just not the one you planned." She looked at him across the cabin, and something passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but the first shape of something real. Neither spoke again before sleep, but the stillness that followed was not empty. It was full. The ground had softened under the late April thaw, and each step along the edge of Lawson's pasture pressed a shallow print into the earth. Priscilla walked with a basket on her arm, picking her way between patches of last year's flattened grass and new green blades pushing up stubborn as fence nails. A hawk circled wide above the cottonwoods, its cry sharp against the wind. Behind her, the cabin stood quiet. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the scent of wood ash still clung to the sleeves of her dress. She had risen early, earlier than Lawson this time, and put on her shoes without waking him. The open sky called her outside, away from the walls that still felt borrowed. She bent to gather the fallen twigs scattered beneath the trees, her fingers brushing cool bark. She hadn't known she missed this, the simple rhythm that came with having a task in hand and no one watching. "Morning's warmer out here," Lawson said behind her, his voice low and unhurried. She turned, startled, but not unpleasantly. He carried a pail in one hand, the other resting against his belt. His boots were damp with dew, and his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbow. "I thought you were still sleeping," she said. "I heard the door. Figured you'd wandered off to join the coyotes." "I haven't heard a coyote since I arrived. They're quieter this time of year. Still around, though." She stepped aside as he crouched to fill the pail from the rain barrel. The water splashed in soft. She watched the sun find his shoulders, the way his hair curled a little at the nape where the sweat had dried from yesterday's ride. "I've never lived where you could see weather coming from 3 directions at once," she said. He stood, sloshing a bit of the water over the rim. Makes it harder to lie to yourself about what's ahead. She smiled faintly, then looked down at the twigs in her basket. Did you always plan to settle here? No. I came looking for something else. But the land didn't ask much of me, just work. That seemed fair. She watched him carry the pail toward the trough. The wind caught her skirt again, and this time, she didn't fight it. Later that day, the sun climbed higher, and they took to weeding the narrow stretch of garden behind the cabin. She knelt beside the rosemary and onion shoots, her gloves thick with soil. Lawson worked close by, silent except for the occasional clink of his trowel tapping rock. Do you think Marta told others about me? She asked, brushing her wrist across her forehead. He didn't look up. Likely. I suppose I should mind. Do you? She shook her head. I think I'm past caring what strangers think. Lawson leaned back on his heels and wiped his hands on his trousers. That'll serve you well out here. She watched him a moment before returning to her work. What became of your family? He paused, then dug the trowel into the earth again. Father died in Missouri. Ma followed a winter later. My sister married a man back east, moved to Philadelphia. We write sometimes. I'm sorry. He didn't answer at once. They were good people, but they're not here now. She nodded, and the silence between them settled like dust over a trail unspoken. Understood. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, not fierce, but steady. Rain tapped against the roof, and the wind moaned through the eaves. Lawson sat by the fire, stitching a tear in one of his shirts. Priscilla sat across from him, a small tin of buttons in her lap, sorting through them by lamplight. I used to mend for my mother, she said, holding up a brass one. She never could make herself sit long enough to do it. Lawson tied off the thread and bit it clean. You take after her? In some ways, she had a sharp tongue. I never quite managed that. He folded the shirt and set it on the bench. You speak plain. That's not nothing. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the lines along his mouth, the quiet steadiness that had not wavered since the day he'd helped her onto his horse. Why haven't you married? She asked. He didn't shift, didn't glance away. I've seen what happens when folks marry to fill silence. It doesn't hold. I wasn't waiting, but I wasn't rushing either. She set the tin aside. And now, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Now there's someone sitting across from me who listens like she means it. That's rare. She felt her throat tighten, not with grief this time, but something gentler. She stood, crossed to the hearth, then sat beside him on the floor, their shoulders nearly touching. I didn't think I'd have a say in where I ended up, she said. You do now. The fire popped. She didn't move away. He didn't speak further. Outside, the wind bent the trees, but inside, the quiet between them felt like shelter. The first calf was born just after dawn, slick and red against the straw. Lawson crouched beside the heifer, careful and quiet, while Priscilla leaned against the rail of the pen, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of broth that had long since gone cold. She didn't speak. He hadn't asked her to come, but she'd risen when he did, laced her boots, and followed him into the barn without a word. She did well, he said finally, brushing the calf's side with a handful of clean hay. Didn't need much from me. Priscilla stepped closer, watching the newborn tremble and stretch its legs. It's strange how something so new can look like it already belongs here. He straightened, brushing straw from his knees. That's the way of it. New things come and learn the feel of the place quick, or they don't stay. She glanced up at him, but he was focused on the cow, who had begun lowing softly. Do you name them? She asked. Not unless I have to separate one from the rest. She nodded, then turned back toward the cabin. Lawson followed a few minutes later, hanging his coat by the door and shaking the damp from his hat. She had already set the kettle on the stove and was grinding more coffee beans with the small mill he kept near the window. "I was thinking," she said, not looking up, "about putting together a ledger." "For what?" "Your accounts, trade records, what you plant and when. You've got everything in your head. But if something happened, if you were gone a few days or laid up, I wouldn't know where to begin." He leaned against the doorframe. "You'd take care of things?" "If I'm here, I'd like to be useful." He studied her. "You'd be more than that." She met his eyes then. "I'd like to help build something, not just get through the days." He didn't answer right away, but she saw something shift in him. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. That afternoon, Priscilla borrowed a pair of shears and trimmed back the wild growth along the edge of the fence. Lawson repaired the hinge on the shed door, the one that had sagged all winter. They didn't speak much, but their movements fell into rhythm, like two hands working the same cloth from opposite ends. As the sun dropped low and the wind cooled, he washed up at the pump while she folded the last of the linens she'd aired out on the line. He dried his hands on his trousers and stepped onto the porch where she stood, her arms full of folded fabric. "You ever thought about staying?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer at first. The wind stirred her hair loose, and she tucked it behind her ear before speaking. "I think about it every morning. More each day." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about asking." "Didn't want to press." "You didn't." He stepped down, took the linens from her arms, and carried them inside. When she followed, she found him placing them carefully into the trunk at the foot of the bed, the one she still hadn't fully claimed as hers. She crossed the room and laid her hand on the lid. "I'd like a place to write that ledger," she said. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "You can use the desk." "I meant something of my own. A table near the window. Doesn't have to be big." He nodded. "I can build that." She looked down, then back up. "I'd like to make curtains, too. Cloth with some color. Something to mark the days." He stepped closer. "You already have." They stood there for a long moment, the last light of the day slanting across the floorboards, dust motes drifting like slow rain in the glow. He reached up and brushed a streak of dirt from her cheek with the back of his fingers. "You were never just passing through, were you?" he asked. She shook her head. "I didn't know it at the time, but no." He rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm and steady. "I'd marry you tomorrow if you let me." She exhaled, her hand finding his. "Then ask me tomorrow." Their fingers twined together, the quiet between them no longer uncertain, but full of understanding. Outside, the cottonwoods murmured in the wind, and the first stars came out, one by one. The next morning broke clear and windless, the kind of spring light that settled gently over the land without urging it forward or holding it still. Lawson stepped quietly into the barn to check on the calf before sunrise and found it nursing strong, its legs steadier than the day before. He stayed just long enough to make sure the heifer was eating, then returned to the cabin where the smell of flour and lard hung warm in the air. Priscilla stood at the stove in her green dress, the one she'd mended herself, her hair pinned away from her face. She didn't turn when he entered, but she reached behind her and placed his tin cup on the table. In the same breath, she flipped the biscuit dough onto its second side. "I thought you said you weren't going to do anything special," he said, voice still thick with sleep. "I changed my mind," she replied. "You asked me to marry you." Seemed worth heating the kitchen for. He poured water into the basin and washed his hands in silence. He didn't need to say anything. Her presence in his home had already changed everything, and now it was only becoming real in the way she moved through the space like it was hers. By mid-morning, they were riding toward the Jorgensen's claim. Marta met them halfway down the trail, arms folded beneath her apron. her expression unreadable until Lawson dismounted and lifted Priscilla down from the saddle. "You're early," Marta said, though she opened the gate without further comment. "Not too early for vows," Priscilla said. Marta's mouth twitched. "We've the preacher in the parlor. He was here for the birth of my niece's baby. He'll do." The ceremony was short. The preacher had a voice like gravel and a wife with sharp elbows and a gentle smile. Lawson and Priscilla stood before the fireplace in the Jorgensens' front room, the scent of yeast bread and old pine filling the air. No rings exchanged, neither had one to offer, but Lawson took her hands with a steadiness she hadn't known she needed until it was there. When the vows were spoken and the preacher nodded, Marta brought out a jar of blackberry preserves and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. They ate in the yard under the cloudless sky, and though there were no musicians or dancing, the quiet laughter between them carried farther than any fiddle ever could. Later, back at the homestead, Lawson took a wide plank from the shed and began shaping it with his drawknife. Priscilla sat nearby on a milking stool, her needle tracing seams through a length of blue calico. She didn't ask what he was making, she had a guess, but she watched the way his hands moved, slow and sure, each pull of the blade revealing something solid beneath the rough bark. "That's going to be a fine table," she said. He didn't look up. "It'll hold." That evening, they shared supper at the cabin's small table, the new one still unfinished. She'd set 2 mismatched plates with folded cloth napkins, and he'd brought in a single branch of wild plum to place in a jar at the center. They ate by lamplight, and when the meal was done, she stood and reached for his hand. "Come outside," she said. He followed her into the night. The stars were sharp and close, the air still holding a hint of warmth from the day. She led him to the edge of the clearing where the cottonwoods stood tall, their leaves whispering overhead. "I used to think I'd have to become someone else to find peace," she said. Lawson looked at her, the moonlight catching at the edge of her cheek. "And now, I think I just needed someone who saw me as I was." She stepped closer, placing her hand at his chest. "You never asked me to be anything other than myself." His hand came over hers, rough and warm. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. I don't want you any other way." She leaned into him then, her head resting beneath his chin, and he wrapped his arms around her like they'd always belonged there. They stayed like that until the night deepened and the wind stilled. When they returned to the cabin, it was quiet but not silent, the kind of quiet that lives in places where things are finally right. Years passed, but the peace never left. They finished the table together, and she kept her ledger beside a small kerosene lamp on its corner. She planted rows of squash and beans that summer, and by harvest, she had a pantry lined with jars she had filled herself. Lawson built a second stall for the growing herd, a new well just south of the garden, and a porch that looked east so they could sit with coffee and watch the sun rise. Marta visited often, always under the pretense of trading eggs or borrowing sugar, though she rarely left without smiling in that quiet, crooked way of hers. And when a letter arrived from Priscilla's aunt in Boston, one she hadn't heard from in 3 years, she read it aloud by the fire, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the ledger with her other records of the life she'd built. In winter, they sat close by the hearth, his leg always touching hers, her stitching small things for neighbors' children or mending seams worn by work. He read aloud sometimes, old trail journals or borrowed volumes from town. She never interrupted, but he could feel when she was listening hard, her fingers stilling in her lap. They never spoke of the man who'd left her waiting at the station. There was no need. In spring, they planted more rows. In summer, they built a smokehouse. In fall, they stacked firewood higher than the porch rail. And in each season, they met each morning with the same exchange of quiet glances and unspoken promises, the kind that didn't need repeating. They endured storms and dry spells, years lean and years full, but they endured together. And in the enduring, They found joy not loud or sudden, but steady and deep, like water beneath stone. When their first child came a daughter with dark hair and wide eyes, Lawson held her as though the world had never held anything so precious. Priscilla watched him from the narrow bed, her hand resting on her chest, her breath shallow but even. "She's strong," she whispered. He didn't take his eyes off the child. "Just like her mother." And when the child cried sharp and new, Priscilla smiled, the kind of smile that didn't fade when the light changed. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the cabin stood as it always had, sturdy, weathered, and full of life.